From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump will skip the second Republican debate next week in California as the continued slide of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis leaves the non-Trump faction more fractured than ever. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Bill McGurn and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. Former President Trump skipped the first Republican debate in Milwaukee last month. The second is now scheduled for next Wednesday in California at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. And news reports this week say that President Trump has decided that he will sit that one out as well. Instead, he will travel to Detroit and give a speech to union workers, a union audience there. Let's start with a couple clips of two of President Trump's rivals reacting to this news. First is Mike Pence on CBS on Tuesday.
I think it's a missed opportunity for Donald Trump, and I think it's a missed opportunity for Republican voters. Look, this country's in a lot of trouble. Joe Biden has weakened America at home and abroad, and I think the former president, just like all the rest of us vying for the Republican nomination, owe it to the American people to express what our agenda will be for turning this country around.
And here is Chris Christie on Fox News, also on Tuesday.
We now have Donald Trump, who's hiding behind the walls of his golf clubs and only going into very controlled circumstances where, he doesn't get to be asked questions by voters. I mean, I think this is incredibly disrespectful to voters, Neil. They have a right to hear from him about his record when he was president, about what his plans are if he were to be the nominee again. And he just is ignoring it.
Meantime, here is some new reporting also from Bloomberg. It says former President Donald Trump plans to skip the third Republican presidential debate, according to a senior advisor who spoke on condition of anonymity, extending his strategy of avoiding forums that include his lower polling rivals. Bill, what do you make of this? And do you suppose this is potentially a mistake by President Trump to not be there on stage during these debates that are getting millions of viewers and responding to the attacks that are inevitably going to come his way?
That's where I disagree with Mike Pence, who said it's a missed opportunity. I agree with you. It's potentially a missed opportunity. I also agree with the second part of what Pence said and what Chris Christie says. You would think if you're asking Republicans to nominate you for president, you have an obligation to go before them in debate and explain why you're better than the other guy. But the only mechanism for enforcing that is a Republican voter. And right now, they're staying with Trump. The danger is, like if you've ever played a basketball or a football game and your team had a big lead and you try to sit back on it, when you lose the momentum, if you lose the momentum, it becomes very hard to catch up later. So I think you were right to say potentially. We don't know yet. I would like to see a debate that included Donald Trump, and I'd like to see him answer questions. What if Joe Biden refuses to debate? He can just say, well, Donald Trump didn't debate in the primaries. Why should I debate him?
Mene, the other thing I think is interesting about President Trump's announcement is his idea of the counter-programming that he wants to present to voters and the American public. We are in the middle of an auto strike launched by the United Auto Workers, and that's where President Trump wants to be. He wants to be in the middle of that, giving a speech to union workers. But meanwhile, this is a statement by Sean Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers, responding to the news of President Trump's visit. He says, every fiber of our union is being poured into fighting the billionaire class and an economy that enriches people like Donald Trump at the expense of workers. We can't keep electing billionaires and millionaires that don't have any understanding what it is like to live paycheck to paycheck and struggle to get by, and expecting them to solve the problems of the working class. So to the extent that President Trump is going up there and trying to say to these auto workers, I'm on your side and you should consider voting Republicans, he is being told a definite no by the head of the UAW.
Yeah, I think Trump's decision to go to Detroit and make a speech to auto workers is in keeping with his longtime habit of trying to cast himself as a tribune of the working class. Earlier in the year, when there was a major train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, he also showed up there. He likes to cast himself as being outside the fray, not going to engage in these debates with the candidates who are challenging him for the nomination. And instead, I'm spending my time with the average working man fighting on your behalf. So it's not at all surprising that he's taking this approach. But I also think that his ability to actually gain the support of these voters is something very tricky. And I'm not surprised also by Sean Fain's comments that he wants nothing to do with Donald Trump, his candidacy, or the Republican Party by extension. These unions are very wedded to the Democratic Party, which they funnel a lot of donations to, which they drive their members to vote for. And once Democratic politicians are elected, they depend on them to pass policies that protect the influence and power of the unions, and Sean Fain is no different. So Trump probably thinks that he can burnish his credentials with ordinary rank-and-file auto workers, some of whom have become disenchanted with the Democratic Party for cultural reasons, some of whom believe that President Biden has done a bad job growing the economy in a way that affects their livelihoods, but most of whom, particularly in a deep blue and heavily unionized state like Michigan, are going to continue to be identified with the Democratic Party, and he'll find it very hard to actually peel those voters away.
But on the point about skipping the debates, Bill, it is one thing to get away with that one time or two times. But if he really is not going to participate in the third debate, it raises the question whether he intends to participate in any of these debates at all. And to my eye, I wonder whether some voters would start to feel like their support is being taken advantage of and start to consider some of these people who are up there on the stage making the cases for their candidacies. And I also think that these debates are really useful forms to hash out some of the arguments within the party. And I'll pick just a couple to talk about here. One is abortion. President Trump recently said that Governor Ron DeSantis made a, quote, terrible mistake, unquote, by signing the 6-week abortion ban in Florida. And yet he is not going to say exactly where he would draw the line. I think that is a serious issue, a serious question for all sorts of voters in Iowa and New Hampshire and beyond. And I wonder whether he will be able to get away with that line all the way through the Iowa caucuses. Another is COVID-19, where outside of these debates, the candidates are exchanging a little bit of fire. So President Trump recently had an advertisement attacking Lockdown Ron and saying that Ron DeSantis' COVID policies failed Florida. And Ron DeSantis responded to that. Here's a piece of what he said. He said, even January of 2021, I was getting hit by the White House task force under Trump. Weeks before he left office, they were sending us missives to Florida saying, impose a mask mandate and close bars and restaurants and businesses. So, Bill, here are just two places where there's a real argument going on about policy and about the records of these candidates that want to be the next president of the United States. And I do think that it is a disservice to voters just to opt out of that.
Yes, it is. The problem is it's up to voters to make it clear they feel the insult and they're not going to tolerate it. So far, they haven't. But I agree with you, especially on the Meet the Press interview Trump gave on Sunday, where he made the abortion comments. That didn't go down well with pro-lifers who are abundant in Iowa. And in fact, the governor of Iowa attacked Trump on the issue because she also signed a heartbeat law in her state, and it was an implicit defense of DeSantis. So he could be punished in the caucuses for that. I think other candidates have to raise the issue from the debate stage that Trump is not there. But until those poll numbers change, he's not going to change. He's going to stick with his strategy and take all the criticism, but he'll feel he'll still win the nomination. You know, from his point of view, he's vulnerable on things you mentioned. Why should he give his opponents the chance to attack him if he doesn't have to?
The other question that I think is interesting is the matter of consolidating the field and when or whether that will happen. So just as a reminder, the threshold to participate in the first debate was showing 1% support in some polling. For the second debate, that has been raised to at least 3%. And according to the reporting right now, there are two candidates who are at risk of not being able to participate in this debate and go on stage in California on Wednesday. They are Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. But at least so far, Governor Burgum at least is saying that this is not going to affect his candidacy. Here is what he said. We're going to be on the ballot in Iowa and New Hampshire, whether we're part of this debate or not. I think it's a goofy clubhouse rule, so we're going to keep charging forward. And Monet, I wonder how much that attitude is shared among all of the candidates that are left in the field. So far, we've only had one guy drop out, that is Miami Mayor Francis Suarez. But if we don't get some consolidation, we may see a repeat of 2016, where the faction of the party that does not want to nominate President Trump is sizable and maybe a majority, and yet they can't agree on who they want to nominate instead.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating at this point to think back to January of this year, right after the November midterm elections and the beginning of the new Congress and the kind of new season of politics, when we were just gearing up for the start of this race. And Ron DeSantis looked like an absolute juggernaut, and people were debating and speculating about whether or not he was going to completely clear the field, whether donors would consolidate around him early, whether other candidates would be scared to even get in because DeSantis was polling ahead of Trump in many of these polls, and it really looked like it might turn out to be a two-person race. What we instead got was a pretty lively and crowded field, and I think that's for the benefit of Republican primary voters, having more options and also getting to see how these candidates actually perform on the debate stage. And in the field, Ron DeSantis has underperformed compared to how people expected he would do as a presidential candidate. But the problem is that it now looks as if there's a slim and diminishing chance that any single competitor to Trump is going to emerge by the time we reach the early primaries. And if that vote among the lots of people in the Republican Party base who don't want to vote for Trump ends up being split among even 3 or 4 or 5 competitors, that's going to make it nearly impossible for Trump to lose his commanding lead in some of these primaries. And he could end up regaining the nomination the same way he did in 2016, merely by being a plurality winner because he has such a loyal contingent of supporters across all of these states.